Good evening. It's very nice to see you all. I apologize, but I came down with a cold first thing this morning, so I'm going to try and keep you guys non-infected. It's the first cold I've had in quite some time. We're actually going to talk a little bit about some of the housing recommendations, but at a very high level, as Katrina and Eric and I were all starting to talk about how we wanted to introduce the topic of zoning changes and the MBTA Communities Act. We thought it might be nice to focus the first meeting on housing in general and then drill down. So to keep everything lively, we're going to do a little bit of a presentation first, then an exercise, a group exercise where you can all work together, then another presentation, and then a second exercise. And you'll see how they build on each other. So we'll talk about housing, we'll do the what and where exercise, we'll talk about the MBTA Communities Act, and then we'll talk about how much. So there were a couple of recommendations. Katrina mentioned several plans, and we went through the plans and pulled out the different zoning recommendations that each plan had. So the housing production plan, master plan, there was a zoning audit that was done a few years back. We pulled them all together. We've got a chart that we're working through. And today I'm going to show you some of the recommendations for each plan for different types of housing for the community to consider. So you'll see what are, because we'd like to define them for you, the recommendation, the document that the recommendation came from, and a definition and an image. We're going to start off with accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units have been a common topic in many communities. It basically allows a homeowner to put a second unit in some communities, in their home. In other communities, they allow it attached to or on a secondary building. You can see from this diagram some of the different ways people have put them together. They're seen as, they used to be called in-law apartments in many communities. And they are seen as ways of helping people add additional income so that they can pay higher mortgages, ways that seniors can continue to live in their homes, which is why AARP is interested in them, ways for younger people to stay within their community. So it's something that's been brought forward from the Housing Production Plan as an idea. From the zoning audit, we had the idea of single-family conversions, and you see a single family here that was converted into a duplex or a two-family. Single-family conversions can be converted into any number of units. I would say 2 to maybe 4, depending on the size of the house, is probably the most common that I've seen. So that is certainly an option, and the idea is that they really are 2 separate units, but within the same building. Shared living, also coming out of the Housing Production Plan, is a way for people who can share a housing unit together, sharing costs, maintaining housing such as rent and utilities. Sometimes it's been group housing is one form of shared housing, but there are other ways of doing that. A similar idea that was not mentioned in your plans, but I bring it forward because it's quite close to shared housing, is the idea of co-living or co-housing. And the image I'm showing on the screen is actually for a senior community, but there are co-living or co-housing arrangements that are targeted towards younger people who may be new professionals. They have basically a built-in community that they're working with. So there are options at kind of both ends of the age spectrum to address this. And the idea is that they're living in the same dwelling unit or on the neighborhood level, but the idea is that the units are smaller because there's more common space that is openly shared. So you might have a kitchenette in your unit, but there's a big community kitchen or community space that everybody is using. In this case, these buildings are all clustered around a common, and they have a large common space that they can share both indoors and outdoors. Cottage-style housing, this one is actually on the Cape, is a way of building smaller houses that are more connected to each other in a neighborhood format. They look like, wait for it, cottages, thus the name, but they're really these smaller sized dwelling units, and a lot of these go to the idea of affordability by design. In other words, they're not capital A affordable with subsidized financing. They are more about the units are smaller, the land area is smaller, and therefore the housing is more affordable. Village-style development starts to bring us into a sort of more mixed-use style. And I picked this picture because it shows how different types of housing. So you get the yellow as a single family here. You get the orange as a little bit more dense multifamily. The pieces down here are office or commercial. This is obviously a new development on new land, but the principle of having single-family homes, more dense residential, such as 3 or 4 families, some larger, along with walkable to retail, restaurant services, is really what villages are about. And so we have a lot of villages in New England that developed over time and can be repurposed to be supported to have the housing support the commercial areas of those. And finally to multifamily, which we'll talk about more in depth later on. So multifamily housing as defined by the MBTA Communities Act is either 3 dwelling units or more in a single building on a lot, or it is 2 buildings on a lot, each with more than 1 unit. So your minimum is either 3 dwelling, townhouse, 3 family, whatever, or it is 2 duplexes would be your minimum. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is this idea of what's called missing middle housing, which was popularized a couple of years ago. And it's what's happening between the detached single-family homes and the much larger mid to high rise that would happen in, say, a much more urbanized environment. So this missing middle is really the duplexes, the triplexes, 4 families, all the way up to something like courtyard apartment, townhouse development, multiplex, which is a little bit more. Think of it in the, say, 3 to 6, 8 to 12, 12 to 20 sorts of ranges. And quite frequently, this type of housing fits in well, could be an infill to a village style development. It could be, especially like the 3 or the 4s, if you think of that as fitting by design, neatly into a single family or 2 family neighborhood. It's a way of getting more housing in, but being cognizant of the existing context for the development. So on your table, you have a couple of maps, which is good because you're not going to be seeing them as well here. And what we're going to ask you in the first exercise is to start thinking about where these different types of housing that have been recommended through the different studies might actually fit in Middleton. So we have some maps to help you think about that. The first one here on the far, my far right, your far left, shows you what type of housing exists now. We use the assessor's data to say, okay, if we're looking at Middleton today, what type of housing is actually in Middleton? Where is it located? And how is it sort of distributed across the town? So the middle map is your current zoning, and the final map I'll explain more in detail in a little bit, but it's about thinking about where to place housing in terms of its proximity to goods, services, and walkability. So I mentioned this is the distribution of existing housing types based on your assessor's data, and you can see the different colors meaning different types of housing. Zoning talks about what can be here in the future. So what you have now exists, some of it may actually have existed before zoning did. Zoning is effectively the rules by which you can have future change. So if somebody has a single family house, they want to turn it into something else, it has to be zoned for them to be able to do that. So this is the current zoning map, and we've got 4 residential districts. R2 allows multifamily, but only as a special permit. So that's something we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the MBTA Communities Act. So all of the residential districts allow single family, and then R1A, R1B, and R2 allow 2 families by special permit. Special permit is a higher standard of approval than by right. With by right, you can just go get a building permit and you're fine, you can do that. A special permit requires that you go to the planning board and meet certain additional requirements in order to be able to do that. So that's what could be here in the future. Now let's talk about what should be here, and this is where the parcel scores come in. So what we do is we have a list of the criteria of a good neighborhood. How far away is it from schools? How far away is it from shops? How walkable is it to services like the library? And we run this through a model, and we can certainly, this is sort of our basic model, we can certainly tweak it on a community basis if the community starts to really delve into what's important to them. But for now, for today's exercise, think about it as we run this through, we then assign points to it based on how many criteria we meet. And in this case, the more criteria, the warmer the color, so red becomes a very walkable area. The greener you get, the less walkable it is. And that's not saying one's good or one's bad, but once you start thinking about where would you like to put housing, if you're interested in doing things like reducing traffic, focusing on current or reducing congestion, focusing on current infrastructure rather than having to build new infrastructure, thinking about what's walkable will help to reduce those things. In other words, if people can walk to a grocery store or bike to a grocery store, they might be less likely to jump in the car. Or if the grocery store is on their way home from work, they're already making that trip. So we like to, when we can, cluster housing near these walkable areas. So I'm going to stop, see if there's any questions on what you've seen so far, and then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do first.
Each community has to allow or be able to permit multifamily housing, as Emily said, 3 or more units in a single structure or 2 duplexes on a lot at a minimum. You have to be able to permit that as a right. Right now, many communities, I think including Middleton, can permit multifamily housing using a special permit, which is discretionary. This says if you have control of a piece of land and you follow the zoning as it's written, you can build what it says. You don't have to jump through the extra hoops of a special permit. You cannot have age restrictions be applied. So a lot of times multifamily, in some communities, they may say, oh, this is only for people 55 and older or 65 and older. It needs to be open to everybody, and it needs to have unit sizes, at least some of them, that are suitable to families. So in some communities, they might write the zoning, you can only build 1 and 2 bedrooms, for example, or studio and 1 bedrooms, right? And where families can't really live, you're not allowed to do that under the law. The third thing is you have to have a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units an acre. So if you have an acre of land, you need to be able to fit 15 or more units on that acre of land, just by way of an easy example. And then in some communities that have commuter rail or subway or ferry service, and that's not Middleton, a certain portion of your district has to be located within a half-mile radius, but you all don't have to worry about that. It's really the first piece.
And if you don't have sewer throughout your community, how do you meet the 15 density requirement on septic systems?
We'll talk about that. Good question. So I did want to point out just a couple things about what the MBTA Communities Act is not. Emily and I have been working in a lot of communities, so we've kind of heard a lot of the questions and some of the misunderstanding around the law. So one key thing is really the first 2 bullet points, and this is often the hardest for people to sort of wrap their heads around. The unit capacity that we'll talk about later on, it's not a mandate to actually build the housing, it's really just about zoning for the housing and creating the possibility for someone who either owns land or purchases land at some point to actually build. So it doesn't mean that, even though Middleton's number is 750, doesn't mean that Middleton or folks in Middleton have to produce 750 units. You just have to zone and set the regulations such that that can be built. It is not restricted to addressing just affordable housing needs. You can choose to make affordable housing part of the zoning, or you could not, but it's not a mandate to include affordable housing. So some communities are doing that, some communities might not. And this is not a one-size-fits-all tool to address all the housing needs. Emily went over the housing sort of typology and recommendations, like accessory dwelling units, for example, doesn't fit with MBTA communities, but it is a type of housing that could potentially help address your needs over time. So this is kind of focused on the multifamily segment. And then, at least as of right now, it's not viewed as optional by the state or by the Attorney General. She's come out already and said that there will be some ramifications for communities that choose not to comply or don't comply. I don't know exactly what those will be, but that's sort of what she said. So So this is just a quick map of all the 177 MBTA communities. And the one thing that I wanted to talk about just on the next slide is these colorations on the map, they sort of show the different categories of communities. There's 4 of them. There's the rapid transit communities, which are mostly centered around Boston and have subway service. There's the commuter rail communities that are served directly by commuter rail. And then there's the adjacent communities that are sort of adjacent to those that have MBTA service. And then there's adjacent small towns, which are designated by a smaller threshold of population. So we show this slide just to show the date by which Middleton and all adjacent communities would need to submit their compliance application to the state, which is the end of December of 2024, so about a little over a year from now. I think we'll learn a lot in the next 2 or 3 months from the rapid transit communities because their deadline is at the end of this year of 2023. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, would you happen to know how these guys got out of this?
How Boston got out of this?
Yeah.
I don't know the specific reason. If I had to guess, it would just be because they're Boston. I don't know.
All right, I'm just saying.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
I think they already meet the requirement. Put it that way.
Yeah.
They've already
Yeah,
got
they
that.
probably would meet it very easily with their zoning.
What's that little white town on the bottom?
It's in the middle, just underneath.
Just under the purple.
Yeah.
What town is that?
I think that's Avon.
Uh-huh.
It's just north of Brockton. I think
That's strange, huh, to be.
Yeah,
Right,
well,
yeah.
Flipping off the state.
Yeah, there's also a cluster in the boroughs at Hudson.
That's understandable, but I don't understand the other,
Yeah,
the little one there.
I don't know. Maybe they had a really powerful legislator at some point. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a handful of them that for some reason didn't make it in. And so just in terms of the implication, this came out a couple months ago. The state tried to put some more detail around what would happen if communities didn't comply. So some of the bigger things is the town would lose the opportunity to apply for certain grants or be eligible for grant funding. I think for the smaller communities, the MassWorks grant, the infrastructure grant is a big one that you wouldn't be eligible for. So I mentioned the Attorney General did have the advisory guidance in March of this year talking about what happens if communities don't comply. So there are a lot of grants from different state and quasi-state agencies that they've added to this list.
Does this also apply since it's the MBTA Communities Act, they will be willing to start like running buses out here? Because like if they're not gonna be providing service, why are we considered in it if?
Because we get to pay to support the MBTA.
Yeah, we get the ride.
Yeah.
We do get the ride. Yeah, we do.
Okay.
I think that the right is the thing.
It was like, what, 4 people in town?
We get the ride.
Take us for
We need to
Yeah, right.
It's a fair question.
talk to our senator.
I mean, it's like buses would be cool.
Yeah.
The ability to get in and out, that would be nice, but like.
Yep.
We did have buses at one time, they only stopped at Angelica's, and they would take people to Boston. And then it wasn't used so much, and we just got rid of it.
As I mentioned, there's a ton of different tools that a community could use to address housing at different types, different price points, all the way from those who are experiencing homelessness and are unsheltered all the way to sort of market rate. And you can see the MBTA Communities Act is really sort of in the moderate income workforce and market rate housing, mostly because you can include an affordability component to it. It is restricted. This is sort of how deep you can go on the affordability restrictions, but it could be helpful in sort of those 2 categories as we're thinking about it. And the other thing that I wanted to say, sort of looping back on what the MBTA communities is not, this really isn't a housing production target. It's really about zoning. And one question Emily and I have gotten in a lot of communities is, well, what would happen if, we created the zoning for 750 units? Someone's going to come in and build 750 units, tomorrow. And I think we all know that there are a lot of forces at play just outside of zoning that sort of regulate whether someone's going to build housing or not. Can they actually buy the land? Can they get it at a reasonable price? What is the market strength in the community? How much housing could be absorbed over a certain period of time? So there are a lot of other factors that are sort of guiding housing production. We just like to remind people that because, I know the number is big in most communities and it's sort of scary, so it's good to kind of keep it in perspective. Okay, so now I want to get just into a little bit more detail about some of the common questions that we get, because invariably these tend to come up more than others. We get a question a lot about mixed use, particularly in communities that have a downtown or have a mixed use area. And they're asked us, is mixed use allowed? So under the law, mixed use is an allowable use as part of MBTA communities. But the key thing is, in your designated MBTA district, you can't mandate mixed use in order to build multifamily housing. So someone could you could allow them to build multifamily housing as of right, you can allow them to do mixed use, which is housing over commercial as of right, but you can't tell someone in an MBTA district, in order to build that multifamily housing, you have to give me commercial too. So you can allow it, but you can't mandate it. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is about affordability. The law does give leeway to communities to consider adding basically what's called inclusionary zoning or affordable housing into the zoning. You're limited at 10% of the units at 80% of area median income. So for example, if someone proposed let's make it easy, a 10-unit multifamily building, if you had 10% of those units as affordable, they would have to give you one deed restricted affordable unit, and they would have 9 market rate, and that would make up your 10 units. And that one deed restricted affordable unit would be limited to a person or a household earning 80% of the area median income.
And is there anything in the MBTA legislation about whether the units built are rentals or home ownership?
Nope, absolutely not. Yeah, zoning can't dictate one or the other.
Maybe, but the state doesn't, the state always puts mandates on that you would not think would be logical or
Gotcha.
legal.
Yeah, so, yeah, the answer is no. They don't mandate one way or another.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Can you include municipal owned land as part of the area?
So you can, with the caveat that piece of property that you want to put into it has to be working its way through a disposition process to dispose of it for housing.
Okay.
Can you offer an incentive to increase the amount from 10% to say 15% affordable housing if you gave them a density bonus, or is that allowed in the MBTA zones?
You definitely can do that if a community wants to go above the 10% threshold or set the affordable restriction below 80%. The state mandates that you have to do what's called an economic feasibility analysis, which is essentially it's a development pro forma analysis to make sure that if you go above those restrictions, you're not putting an undue hardship on the developer. They're trying to do that because, let's say a community wanted to play games and say, okay, instead of 10%, we're going to require you to do 50%. Well, now basically nothing's going to work, no one's going to build, right? So they try to come up with reasonable thresholds for those. But you're right, you can go, I believe, as high as 20%, and then you can go below 80%. But you just have to do that, sort of the extra step.
And you can give a bonus. So that's true of the mixed use as well as of the housing. If you did a mixed use in this area, you get an extra floor of height or less parking or whatever that incentive is. That's acceptable, right? That's going above and beyond the minimum requirements. Same thing for multifamily. If you gave a bonus, you could go deeper. But if you're just saying we want to require 20% or we want 60%, then you have to do the EFA.
We sort of touched on this before, what about sort of senior housing or housing for older adults? Again, you could allow it, you just can't mandate it and say, well, if you want to build multifamily here, it has to be for 55 and older. But that could be in your use table. You could say, yeah, we would love to see, housing for older adults, just like we would love to see, another kind of housing. Okay, infrastructure. So, I know this may not be the answer that people like to hear, and you may not think it makes sense, but this is what the state did. They basically said this is zoning, and it's irrespective of infrastructure, And there were a lot of questions and comments and written letters about this from communities that are on sewer, that are not on, either public water or public sewer. And the response back was, this is a zoning exercise. In the future, there's the potential that infrastructure could change, there could be new technologies. Developers maybe will do a package treatment plan at their expense if they can get enough units on a particular piece of land. So this is irrespective of traffic impacts, water impacts, stormwater impacts, wastewater impacts, except if you have a local bylaw that sort of controls, some of those things like stormwater, wetlands, things like that, then it's okay. But yeah, this is really irrespective of infrastructure, because it's about zoning.
Eric, just thinking about the future, say we adopt the correct amount of zoning. Has anyone been talking about oversight of future zoning changes? What if someone rezones that parcel and takes it back out? Is the state attorney general gonna say you're gonna have to add another zone somewhere else? Or what if they put an overlay that makes it more difficult to build multifamily housing?
I don't have an answer specifically for that question. The only thing I could say is, let's say there was a zoning change, especially for say like town meeting approves a zoning change, that's gotta go to the attorney general. So I'm wondering I don't know if this is what's gonna happen, but I'm wondering if there's gonna be like a checks and balances process in that review to say,
That's a big job for them.
I
to
agree
be
with you.
overseeing all-
Yeah.
But they have to review all zoning from towns anyway, they don't have to review them from cities. So if the town submits a revision to its multifamily, MBTA Communities Multifamily Zoning Act, the AG is probably, I would anticipate.
There'll be a new AG form.
There will
asks-
almost
Is
certainly,
this
yes.
land zoned
Probably
MBTA zoning?
And they will pay more attention to it to
Right.
check for the compliance. But you're right, I don't think they've gotten far enough to understand what the process will be. on that.
Great question.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay, so the other one we get a lot is about architectural sort of review and site design. So this can be done through a site plan review process, just not a special permit. So you can do it as of right or using site plan review. So that is totally fine. You can also put development standards into the zoning. So these developments need to meet a certain set of criteria and they need to be measurable and quantifiable. We also have a lot of communities that are really interested in putting in design guidelines as well. So sort of controlling the exterior aesthetics, where the building is placed on the lot, the parking, landscaping, things like that. So there are ways that communities can have some level of control sort of about what gets built there that may lie outside of the zoning. Okay, and then the other question we get a lot about is, can we count existing multifamily units? We've had some folks tell us like, well, the housing authority, built an 8-story tower back in the 1960s and it's right in our district. Can we count those 300 units? And the answer is no, because it's about the zoning. It's not about what has been built. Or we've had some communities say, well, we have a development of 200 units that's in the pipeline and they're about to get permitted next month. Can't we count that? Again, it's not about building and it's not about production. It's just about zoning. So we often say as well, if the zoning that those projects are sort of going through, the entitlement process, if that zoning is set up to meet the requirements of the MBTA, then yeah, you should by all means think about including that district as part of your MBTA, but it's really not about units, it's all about zoning.
So if an existing multifamily or mid-sized building is already existing in a zone that we create with this new thing, that'll count.
Well, whether or not the building's there.
Yeah, it's irrespective of what's built.
Oh, okay, I thought you meant like if it wasn't in the zone versus.
No, yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Okay. I'll hand it to Emily for
Take
the
it back over again.
last of it.
So there are 3 concepts that we need to think about when we're talking about MBTA Communities Act. First is the land area, where we're going to zone it, how big that land area is. The second is the capacity, so the unit capacity, which is the number of units that we're zoning for. And the third is the actual zoning itself, provisions of that. each of those, they each interrelate with each other. So if we start to change the land area, that's going to affect the unit capacity, that's going to affect how we zone. If we start changing the zoning parameters, that will affect the unit capacity. That may mean that we have to make the land area bigger or smaller. So your minimum land area requirements, I think you mentioned it earlier, you have a minimum land area of 50 acres. You don't have a station, so you don't have to locate it in a station area, which gives you a lot of flexibility. And you have to have, everybody has to have a minimum contiguous district size, which is half of your total district. So if you had a district of 50 acres, then it would be 25. If you had a district of 100 acres, because you want to spread out the density and lower that down, then you would have a minimum contiguous district size of 50 acres. So it's always 50% of the total district size. Your capacity requirements are the 750 units that Eric mentioned earlier. Again, no station area, and you have to have a minimum density requirement of 15 units per acre. Now, yes.
Can I get clarification, what, were you just saying that we had to have 50 acres,
Yes,
but half of that, 25 acres, has to be in one spot?
yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And I heard, so like, part of that could be wetlands?
No.
No, we'll get to exclude the
Okay.
land when we start talking about the map. I mean, the wetlands can be in there, but it will affect how you get to your unit capacity. It will affect the density per acre. So the key to the idea of the density requirement of the number of units is that you can have multiple districts. I set that up by saying, look, you have to have one big district, but you can have others as long as they're all more than 5 acres. And that's important because it allows you to have different levels of density in different areas. So you can have a couple of areas with a lower density, below 15 units per acre, as long as you have other areas whose density is above 15 units per acre. In other words, you can average them out to 15 units per acre. So as we start to think about the strategies, so the reasons that we're asking you about where you like what type of housing, that may play into how you think about designing your districts. So zoning, I think you're all familiar with zoning, but really think of it as what somebody can or can't do with a piece of land. So we've said, look, you have to have land, you have to have a certain number of units on that land, which can come in all different types of housing. Now let's talk about the rules. So these are some of the rules, and we don't know what you're going to require yet. That's why we're doing this process. So these are some of the types of dimensional standards that you would find in a zoning article. These ones in the red color are the ones that feed directly into the compliance model. So today we're really talking about the land use and capacity. When we come back, we're going to be talking about these, about how those work to create the capacity together. Actually, let me just jump back from here. The key to these dimensional standards is they talk about what you're doing with the land area of the parcel. So that if you start with a parcel, a set of land, a piece of land, you're going to be thinking about how big is that? That's the lot size. What the uses are, obviously we're looking for multifamily as of right. You're going to be thinking how much of that lot size is allowed to be used for building, so that's the lot coverage. How much of it is required for open space? Generally, those two work together, but not always. How much of it is required for parking? Once you know that, you know how much was left, you've got how much is left of the building. You multiply it by the height, you get that volume. That volume is what determines the unit capacity. So as we start to think about where and how much, we'll then move on to how do we actually get there.